Well, thank you. It's very good to be back in Sweden. I'm talking this evening about the subject of my most recent book, which in English is called The Science Delusion, and in America it's called Science Set Free. The science delusion is the belief that science has already understood the nature of reality in principle, leaving only the details to be filled in. This is a very common view in the modern world, and it's found especially among those kind of people who say, I don't believe in God, I believe in science. People like that have a belief in what they call the scientific worldview, which for them provides all the answers. And it leads to, in its extreme forms, a kind of scientific fundamentalism, which I'm sure everyone in this room has encountered. There's nothing that brings out scientific fundamentalism quicker than the mention of the word telepathy. So what I'm doing in this book is looking at the 10 basic dogmas of contemporary science. They're assumptions. They're not proven facts, they're assumptions. And I'm looking at them scientifically to see how well they stand up to a scientific examination. So this book covers the whole field of science, not just psychical research. I will say a few words about psychical research, of course, but the main point of this is to look at the big picture. The 10 dogmas are familiar to everyone here. They're not usually put in a list, but these are the default assumptions of people with a scientific education. And in fact, because our whole culture is based on science, the default assumptions of most educated people. The first is that nature is mechanical or machine-like. And this was built into science from the very beginning in the 17th century. The idea that the universe is a machine, that animals and plants are machines, and that humans are machines as well. In Richard Dawkins' vivid phrase, we are lumbering robots. So it's this machine view of life and nature, which has been fundamental to science and is, of course, fundamental to mechanistic biology and mechanistic medicine. You'll notice that this isn't a testable theory. You can't do an experiment to find out is it a machine or not. It's basically a metaphor. It says nature's a machine. It's like a machine because it works automatically and doesn't have any external guiding power. So it's just a metaphor. So it's not really a testable hypothesis. And it's a useful metaphor in some contexts, but no metaphor is completely useful in every context. So anyway, that's the status of this most fundamental assumption, a metaphor. The second assumption is that the total amount of matter and energy in the universe is always the same. It's fixed forever, except at the moment of the Big Bang when it all suddenly appeared from nowhere. So since the Big Bang, the total amount of matter and energy is assumed to be the same. Again, it's an assumption. No one was there to observe the universe at the moment of the Big Bang to see it all appear. It's just an assumption, and I'll come back to that later. The third assumption is that the laws of nature are fixed. At the moment of the Big Bang, all the laws of the universe suddenly appeared from nowhere, or else they were there before the Big Bang in some non-physical state, as metaphysical realities. And since then, they've been exactly the same everywhere, at all times and in all places. Most scientists don't make this assumption explicit, but it's implicit in the requirement that any experiment should be repeatable anywhere at any time. Why? Because the laws of nature are supposed to be the same everywhere at all times. As my friend Terence McKenna used to say, the assumption, the basic statement of modern science is, give us one free miracle and we'll explain the rest. and the one free miracle is the appearance of all the matter and energy in the universe and all the laws that govern it from nothing in a single instant. The fourth assumption is that nature's purposeless. There's no purpose in nature. The whole of the universe has no purpose. Evolution has no purpose. It's just random mutation and natural selection. Why is nature purposeless? Because it's a machine. You can't prove it's purposeless. It's an assumption again. And why is it purposeless? Because machines have no purpose of their own. A car has no purpose of its own. It doesn't know where it wants to go. You have to tell it where to go. By contrast, an organism is different. Organisms have their own goals. If you get on a horse, the horse may have its own idea about where it wants to go, and it may be difficult to control it, as I've found to my cost when riding horses in Ireland. They've gone to places I didn't want them to go at all. I ended up at a stables at one time instead of going round the ring of Kerry. So the idea that the nature is purposeless is not proved. It's not proved by detailed experiments. It's just an assumption, and it's an extension of a metaphor. The next assumption is that matter is unconscious. The whole universe is made up of unconscious matter, stars, galaxies, planets. All matter is unconscious by its very nature. And according to the doctrine of materialism, the only reality is matter or physical substance or physical reality, and it's all unconscious. There is a problem, of course, with this theory, which is that we're conscious. And I'll come back to that in a moment. We ought not to be, according to this assumption. And the very fact we're conscious is a terrible embarrassment for materialism. So then the next assumption is that all biological inheritance is material, that what we inherit biologically is inherited materially as genes, as epigenetic modifications of genes, as cytoplasmic inheritance. All of these are material. And that's all our inheritance, biological inheritance is material. That's just a basic assumption. The assumption used to be that it was all genetic. Until about the year 2000, as any of you who studied biology will know, the biggest taboo in biology was against the inheritance of acquired characteristics, or Lamarckian inheritance. But that taboo has now been lifted. The inheritance of acquired characteristics has been rebranded epigenetic inheritance, and it's now one of the hottest areas in biology, exciting area of research. So that taboo has luckily evaporated, and we have a whole new area, but it's still material. It's still believed to be in modifications of the DNA or of the proteins that bind to DNA. The seventh assumption is that memories are stored inside the brain. Everything you remember is somewhere inside your head. If you remember where you went on holiday this year or something that happened as a child, all those memories are somehow coded inside your brain in nerve endings or in phosphorylated proteins. No one's been able to find these memory traces despite many efforts, but nevertheless it's assumed they must be there, because if the world is material, then the brain is material, the memories must be in the brain. Liberal materialists will say there could be cellular memory in the heart or in other parts of the body, but still, it's material. This is an assumption. It's a very questionable one. If I have time, I'll show why it's much more questionable than most people imagine. The eighth assumption is that the mind is nothing but the activity of the brain. Everything you think or do or feel is inside your head. Your mind is confined to the inside of your head and is therefore separate from all other minds because it's safely insulated from the outside world by your skull. The ninth assumption follows from the eighth assumption, and it's that psychic phenomena are illusory. Many people think that they've had telepathic experiences or precognitive dreams, or that their dogs know when they're coming home telepathically, or that they've had telepathic telephone calls. But these are not real experiences, they're just coincidences that people falsely interpret, because all these things are impossible, because thoughts could not influence anyone else or anything else at a distance, because the mind is inside the head. And it's because of this materialist assumption that the skeptical organizations have such a deep and intractable opposition to psychic phenomena. It's not because they've looked at the evidence. Most of them haven't looked at the evidence. It's because it's impossible in principle, given their belief system. And the 10th assumption is that mechanistic medicine is the only kind that really works. People may claim to have got better from alternative and complementary therapies or by faith healing, but this is just because they would have got better anyway, or it's nothing but the placebo effect. Of course, the placebo effect itself is unexplained, but it's used to explain these alternative therapies. And these are not just theoretical assumptions discussed in university seminar rooms. They have a huge effect in the real world. Because the academic world believes that alternative and complementary medicine are fake or illusory or nothing but placebo effects, in many countries, Britain's the one I know best, of course, the Medical Research Council in Britain, which spends £800 million of taxpayers' money every year on medical research, spends not one penny on complementary or alternative medicine. I had a conversation with our previous Minister of Science, Lord Sainsbury, and suggested that this might be an area where more funding could be given because it interests millions of people in Britain. He said, well, there's no point. He said, because these people are all quacks, it doesn't exist, there would be a waste of public money. And this attitude affects what's taught in medical schools, it affects what's taught in all the schools, it affects the funding for research. And again, it's just an assumption. So what we have here is 10 default assumptions which most people who believe in the scientific worldview take for granted. Most of them think of them as established scientific facts. They don't realize that they're just assumptions. In fact, they just think they're true. They think that other people, especially religious people and psychic researchers, have beliefs. But they don't have beliefs, they just know the truth. And so these are very deep-seated assumptions, and any time you get into an argument with anyone who believes in that worldview, it's very frustrating because most of them just can't see that it's a belief system. They're convinced that this is just reality proved by science. You know, if this wasn't true, then aeroplanes wouldn't fly and computers wouldn't work and so forth. So it must be true. Well, in my book, what I do is take each of these assumptions and turn it into a question and see how well it fits with the actual evidence of science. I won't have time to discuss all 10 assumptions this evening. I'm going to start with one that's perhaps the least obvious one to question, which is the total amount of matter and energy is always the same. This was the assumption that I myself took for granted for longest. I mean, I challenged most of the others over the years, but it was only a few years ago that I began to question this one. And I thought, well, I thought I should include it in my book because it's definitely a common assumption. And I actually rather hoped that it would turn out to be true. I thought I might appear biased if all 10 assumptions were false. So I was quite willing to accept that the total amount of matter and energy might always be the same. But when I started looking into this, I realized we all learn this at school, in physics classes at school, and most of us take it for granted. But physicists have less reservations than most of us. Most of us are impressed by physics and feel we can't challenge it. But physicists are less impressed by physics because they're the people who actually make up the rules and change the laws and so on. And in the 1980s, it became clear to astronomers and cosmologists that there was a serious problem in explaining the nature of galaxies. That stars were rotating around the center of the galaxy too fast to be explained by the amount of matter in the galaxy. And galaxies are attracting each other too strongly to be explained by the amount of matter they contain. It was assumed that everything was done by gravitation. It's still assumed that's the case. If you added up all the matter in the universe, in a galaxy, all the stars, you make an allowance for brown dwarfs and black holes and things you can't see, galactic gas that you can't see, make a generous allowance for all that. There's simply not enough to explain the phenomena. So this led to an embarrassment for cosmology and theoretical physics in the 1980s. There were two possibilities. Either the universe involves other principles than gravitation in organizing galaxies, that something quite different is involved in the structure of galaxies, or that there's a lot of matter that we can't see that's explaining these effects. And most of them preferred to stick with established theories. So they said, well, there must be a lot of matter we can't see, and so they called it dark matter, because you can't see it. So then the next question is, how much dark matter? Well, that's simple. You just titrate in the right amount of dark matter to make the equations balance. You put in exactly the amount you need to make the theory work. If you discover a galaxy with an unusual bulge, you just put in a bit more dark matter around the bulge to explain the bulge. You can explain everything. It's a beautiful theory. It explains every anomaly in galactic astronomy. But the only problem is no one knows what dark matter is, and there's no independent evidence for it. People have been looking for dark matter for many years, and they've failed to find it. So this is a theoretical construct. There's about 5 times dark matter than there is ordinary matter. And when physicists invented 5 times more matter at the stroke of a pen, nobody got excited and said, oh, you can't do that. You can't just invent matter like that. The amount was, before that was fixed, and we knew how much it was. Now you've magnified the amount of matter 5 times. It wasn't fixed before, and now you're fixing it at a new level just by an arbitrary stroke of the pen. Nobody made that protest. That was fine to invent this dark matter. So then you can ask, is the total amount of dark matter always the same? Because it's 5/6 of the amount of matter in the universe. The answer is nobody knows, because nobody knows what it is or how it works. Having invented all that dark matter, or perhaps I should use a more neutral term, hypothesized the dark matter, that meant the universe had about 5 times more energy than anyone had ever known about before. That meant it had a stronger gravitational pull. That meant that as the universe expanded with all this extra gravity, it ought to slow down in its expansion as the gravity pulled it in. It should have stopped expanding and then at some point in the future begun to contract until the whole thing ended in the opposite of the Big Bang, known in the trade as the Big Crunch. By about the year 1999, most people thought that the universe would be slowing down and it would eventually stop expanding and then it would contract again. But observations of distant galaxies around the year 2000 showed that instead of slowing down, the expansion of the universe was speeding up. So why is it speeding up? No known reason. Well, there must be a reason. So there must be something pushing it apart. There must be some kind of energy pushing it apart that we didn't know about before. What is it? It's dark energy. And how much is there? Just the right amount to explain the facts. So we now have a situation where within physics, 96% of physical reality is made up of dark matter and dark energy. The matter and energy you learned about at school is only 4% of reality. And is the amount of dark energy the same? Well, actually, according to the usual equations of dark energy, the amount of dark energy per unit volume is always the same. But the universe is expanding, so the amount of volume is increasing, so the amount of dark energy is increasing. The universe is now a perpetual motion machine that generates more energy as it expands. So this is the present state of play. So is it true to say the total amount of matter and energy is always the same? This is at best a kind of accounting principle you can use for certain scientific experiments in laboratories, but we can't say that it's true of the whole universe. In fact, with dark energy it seems to be increasing. With dark matter we just don't know. When we come to the application of the law of conservation of matter and energy to humans, or to life, we run into another set of problems. In the 1840s, von Helmholtz, who was an army doctor in the Prussian army, when studying in Berlin, decided it should be his life's work to rid biology of the doctrine of vitalism, the idea that living organisms are alive. Instead, he wanted to prove they're nothing but machines. And so he tried to tackle the idea of energy. If he could prove that living organisms obeyed the same laws of conservation of energy as steam engines, according to the laws of thermodynamics, he could prove they were just machines. He started doing it by experimental measurements, making frogs' legs contract with electric currents and measuring the heat they produced. But the results were inconclusive, and it proved very difficult to do the experiments. So instead, he adopted a theoretical approach, and he said, instead of proving living organisms are machines, we'll just assume they are, and therefore they must obey the law of conservation of energy because they're machines. And this was accepted within mechanistic biology. It wasn't actually experimentally tested with humans until about 1900. Two American researchers called Atwater and Benedict put humans inside calorimeters, and they measured everything that went in and everything that came out, oxygen, carbon dioxide, and so on. And after doing research for several years, with the intention, as they said, of demonstrating the truth of this principle, not examining, but demonstrating, they came out with the expected result, that it was correct within 99.9% of the expected value. Conservation of energy was proved in humans. And after that, it was just taken for granted. This was re-examined in the 1980s by an American nutritionist called Paul Webb, who did classic experiments, put people in calorimeters, measured everything, oxygen, carbon dioxide, urine, feces, food, etc. And he came out with some very disturbing results. Some of the people were using about 25% too much energy. People who were obese were usually using too much energy. The energy was just disappearing. Whereas people who were fasting and doing a lot of exercise were somehow generating more energy than they should, about 25% more energy than they ought to have done. An error of 25%. So he was naturally curious about this, and he went back to look at the original papers by Atwater and Benedict, and he found that they too had found some people were more and some less than the expected value, but they'd adjusted the number of people, fat and thin people, and people doing exercise and people not doing exercise. They'd adjusted the number of people so that when you averaged them all out together, it gave exactly the correct answer. But they had observed the same anomaly. Now, you see, this is quite important because many other non-Western systems of physiology say that there's a kind of energy in humans. The Chinese talk of qi, Indians talk of prana, which they say is a form of energy that humans can access, which is not just based on food. Now, of course, everybody in the world knows that food is an important part of human life. But there are some striking anomalies. There are people throughout history in Europe, India, China, and other parts of the world who appear to have lived for many years without eating. The Latin word for this is in edia, which means fasting. And some great Christian saints, like Saint Teresa of Avila, as opposed to, and in the 19th century, a Bavarian mystic called Teresa Neumann, were well attested to have lived for years without eating. They were investigated by teams of doctors appointed by bishops and so on. Most bishops don't want to be taken in by popular credulity and stuff, and they were actually quite rigorous in their tests, came to the conclusion they really were living without eating. A recent case in India was investigated by the Indian Defence Academy's physiological team, who found that this person seemed to be surviving perfectly well without food, an ancient guru in Gujarat. So there are many examples of people who claim to live without food. And of course, the skeptics say, well, of course they're cheating, they're sneaking out at night and eating when no one's looking. Obviously, that's a thought that occurs to most people. When I first met someone in India who was said to live without eating, I assumed that must be the case. But when you look at the research findings, it's not as simple as that. And so I think it's perfectly possible that these cases are true. If I were running a nutritional institute, I would make this kind of research a top priority, because if it's true, it's extremely interesting, and it shows we've misunderstood basic facts about energy, human physiology, and so forth. And it's not as if nutrition science is the most successful branch of the sciences, with 1/3 of the world's population overweight. It's not as if nutrition science has actually served us very well, and they keep changing their dietary recommendations and in ways that seem extraordinarily ineffective. This is an area of science where I think there are enormous anomalies which are not investigated at the moment because they don't fit into the dogmatic worldview. Now, I want to turn now to the dogma that matter is unconscious. This assumption was built into science in the 17th century by our old friend René Descartes. And Descartes was reacting against the medieval worldview. In the Middle Ages, in the medieval universities and monasteries, Cambridge, Oxford, Bologna, Paris, and so on, the view of nature that was taught was essentially animistic, based on Aristotle and the great work of St. Thomas Aquinas. The official doctrine was that all animals and plants and all living beings, including the earth and the planets and the stars, these are all living beings, they all have souls. They all have their own purposes, their own organizing principles. So they're alive. Nature's alive, and everything has a soul. The word for soul in Latin is, of course, anima. And that's why in English the word for animals is animal, because they're beings with souls. All plants had souls, according to St. Thomas and to Aristotle. The soul of the plant gives the form to the plant. It shapes the developing plant. The growing oak seedling is pulled towards the final form of the oak tree, the mature form of the oak tree, by the soul of the oak, which works by attraction. Souls work by attraction. They pull towards a future state. Now, it was exactly this that the scientific revolution of the 17th century rejected. They rejected the idea there was any ends or goals in nature, teleology, no purposes, no goals, no final causes, to use Aristotle's words. And there were no formal or formative causes, because according to Aristotle and St. Thomas, the soul was the final cause of an animal or plant or a living being. It gave it its goals towards which it moved. And it was also the formal cause. It gave it its form, the form of a plant, the form of a growing embryo, the form of an animal. All these came from the soul. According to St. Thomas, the soul was not in the body was in the soul. So the soul was a formative principle. It formed the shape of the animal or plant. In animals, there was a level of soul called the animal soul that organized the instincts and the sensations and the movements. And in human beings, there was the plant-like soul that shaped the body, the animal soul that gives us our emotions, our senses, and things which we share with the animals. And in addition, the rational or intellectual soul, which is to do with language and conscious thought. Well, what happened in the scientific revolution was that the souls were removed from nature. Instead of being organisms with souls, animals and plants became machines with no souls and no purposes that were just pushed by forces from the past, not pulled from the future. They had no goals, no purposes. And to talk of teleology became a kind of sin in mechanistic science. When I was learning biology at school, I was told by my biology teachers, you must never use the word purpose. You must never ask what anything is for, because there are no purposes in biology. So when I said, well, it looks as if birds build nests to lay their eggs in, they said, no, that's not a purpose. That's just natural selection through chance mutations has enabled birds that do that to survive. So it's entirely unconscious and purposeless. It looks purposive, but we know better. It isn't really. So anyway, Descartes removed the souls from nature, leaving everything in nature as a machine, including the human body. And he got rid of the animal soul and the vegetative soul, the formative souls of plants and animals, and the animal souls that gave animals their instincts, emotions. He left only the rational mind. So instead of a threefold division between, there was the rational mind, then there was a large unconscious psychic system, the soul or psyche or anima, organizing the body. He just had bodies made of unconscious matter and rational minds or spirits, which were present only in human beings, angels, and God. So, and they were immaterial and not located in space and time. Matter was unconscious, material, and occupied space and time. So that was the division on which mechanistic science was founded. It's often called Cartesian dualism, and it involved three different kinds of dualism. A dualism between man and animals, because humans had this rational mind, animals didn't. They were just machines. So you could treat them like machines. You can vivisect them. You can grow them in factory farms. They have no feelings, no emotions, no intelligence. They're just machines. And if you imagine they have feelings, and if you imagine that your dog really has emotions and feelings, that's just an anthropomorphic projection onto the dog. It's not really there, because science has shown the dog is nothing but a machine. So this involved a division between humans and other animals. It involved a division between mind and body. And it involved a division between science and religion. Science got the whole of the physical universe as its field of research and study, and religion got the human spirit, morality, angels, and God. And they were in a separate compartment. This enabled science and religion to coexist for a long time in Europe without too much conflict. It was a kind of concordat. But it withdrew religion from nature, because in the Middle Ages, God was in nature. Nature was not autonomous and separate from God. It withdrew God out of nature, left God as simply something that people believed in as a matter of faith, and possibly as a designing intelligence that started the universe in the first place. And when atheists say, I don't believe in God, that's the God they don't believe in. I do believe in God myself, but I don't believe in that kind of God. So for the mechanistic worldview, God became at best an optional extra. And so the matter was then unconscious, and Cartesian dualism was the main belief system of most Europeans until the 19th century. In the 19th century, there was a movement by people who wanted to get rid of two principles. They thought two was too many, and they just wanted to have one fundamental principle. So one group of people said, well, the ultimate fundamental principle is not matter, it's mind. And so the whole universe is made of consciousness, and matter is a kind of dumbed-down mind. This is the philosophy of idealism. The other school of thought said, no, there's no such thing as spirit or consciousness, or these unconscious Cartesian spirits. There's just matter, and that's materialism. Materialism as a philosophy arises by denying the spirit pole of dualism. That's its historical origins. at one stroke, materialism gets rid of angels and God. If there's no such thing as spirit, then angels and God just vanish. Poof, they've gone. And then you've got a thoroughgoing atheistic worldview based on science, which eliminates God and angels. However, it doesn't eliminate human consciousness. And as I mentioned at the beginning, this is a serious problem. Because this worldview that says matter's unconscious and matter's the only reality fails to explain how we can be conscious. Therefore, some of the leading philosophers of mind in the English-speaking world have spent the last 70 or 80 years trying to prove that we're not conscious. Our consciousness does, or at least the eliminative materialists, the most extreme school, say that this is just folk psychology, to talk in terms of feelings and consciousness, that with the progress of science there'll come a point where we can describe everything about human beings and their experiences in terms of brain physiology, with no need for these old-fashioned concepts, folk psychology. Another group say that consciousness exists as a feeling, but it doesn't do anything. It's an epiphenomenon of the activity of the brain, a kind of phosphorescence around the nerve endings, or a kind of shadow of brain activity that does nothing. We have no free will. We may appear to have it, but that's an illusion, because our consciousness does nothing. And the third school of materialist philosophy tries to say, yes, we do have consciousness, but it's nothing but an illusion produced by our brains. This is one of the predominant views at the moment, the illusion theory of consciousness. But the problem is, it doesn't really get rid of consciousness, because illusion is a mode of consciousness. It presupposes consciousness. And they go round and round in circles. And this is why the very existence of consciousness is called within philosophy the hard problem. It's the hard problem because no one can come up with an answer. Every time a materialist philosopher comes up with what he thinks is an answer, then other ones point out the problems with it, and they come up with what they think is the answer, and then the same thing goes on. It's been going on, it's thousands of careers, billions of dollars have been spent on this over the last 70 or 80 years. Some very clever people in our leading universities have been trying to prove consciousness doesn't exist. Well, there's recently been a kind of rebellion against this within the ranks of philosophy of mind. The first philosopher in the modern period to question this was someone called Galen Strawson, who's a British philosopher. He wrote a very influential paper called "Does Materialism Imply Panpsychism?" To which he answered yes. Panpsychism means much the same as animism. Pan means everywhere. Psyche is soul or mind. Panpsychism is the idea that some level of mind, even in an electron, even in an atom, that panpsychism is a doctrine that extends some kind of consciousness or mind, maybe unconscious mind, to all self-organizing systems, from subatomic particles up to galaxies and the entire universe. Galen Strawson came to this conclusion because he said it's the only way we can explain the emergence of consciousness in human brains. There must be some capacity for this consciousness already there in less organized matter. Otherwise, it's a kind of miracle. You just have a kind of arbitrary miracle where suddenly in one part of nature, the human brain, the light bulb of consciousness is suddenly switched on for no reason with no natural explanation. And to say it's just emerged from something that's totally unconscious, he said, doesn't make sense. Well, this is becoming a bandwagon at the moment. 2 years ago, the leading philosopher of mind in the United States, Thomas Nagel, wrote a book called Mind and Cosmos, Why the Materialist Neo-Darwinian Conception of Nature is Almost Certainly False. And this caused a furore in the intellectual circles in America. He was denounced by all the leading atheists, because he's an atheist himself, as is Galen Strawson. Neither of these people are coming to this from a religious position. They're both coming to it as atheists who think the only way to save science is to admit that there's some kind of mind or consciousness throughout nature. Nagel has also argued there must be purpose in the universe, that there is a purpose in nature, that the whole of evolution, the whole universe has some kind of purpose. Again, he's been attacked by fellow atheists for selling out and going soft in the head, and he's been subject to the most appalling abuse. But this is spreading, and a couple of years ago, Christoph Koch, who's one of the most aggressive, he was one of the most aggressive atheist, materialist neuroscientists, he worked with Francis Crick, came out in favor of panpsychism. And now it's spreading like wildfire. The materialists are jumping ship. And the panpsychism is really the flavor of the month in the academic world. Now, this means that a whole new set of possibilities open up. And of course, as I already said, there's nothing new in panpsychism. The basic philosophy is what everyone in the whole world has always believed, that nature's alive, that animals and plants are truly alive. Anyone who's kept a dog or cat knows that they're not just machines. But traditional societies with shamanic societies, hunter-gatherer societies, medieval Christianity, early Judaism, Islam, all Hinduism, all of them come out of a kind of animistic or panpsychist view of nature. They also have a theology of nature which sees God as within nature, not outside nature. And as God is in nature and nature is in God, according to traditional theologies in all different religious systems. The idea that God and nature are totally separate, that nature is autonomous, has no spirit, no mind, no consciousness, and God is this optional extra external to nature, is a post-17th century European development. It's not present in earlier strands of religious thought. Excuse me. So, as soon as we recognize this, we see there have been many previous panpsychist philosophies. In the 17th century, in reaction to Descartes, there were two important philosophers who were panpsychists. One was Spinoza, who said that the whole of nature is the body of God and God is the mind of nature. It was a kind of pantheist panpsychism. The other was Leibniz, who said that every self-organizing system in nature, a monad, has both a body and a mind, and each monad reflects the entire universe from its own point of view. So each monad is mirroring the universe from its own point of view. The most interesting panpsychist philosopher in the 20th century was Alfred North Whitehead, a British philosopher who was also a mathematician. He taught Bertrand Russell, and they wrote together a famous book on the philosophy of mathematics called Principia Mathematica. In the 1920s, Whitehead was the first philosopher who really understood the implications of quantum theory, because he was a mathematician and could follow the mathematics. Most philosophers didn't know any maths and couldn't follow theoretical physicists. They just believed what the theoretical physicists told them. But he saw immediately that the assumption of quantum theory that even an electron is a wave had enormous implications. To see matter and light as wave phenomena is important, Whitehead pointed out, because a wave takes time. It takes time to wave. You can't have a wave in an instant. It takes time for a wave to happen. It also takes space for it to happen in. And this is the fundamental reason for the uncertainty principle in quantum mechanics, because you can't localize a wave. Something that's wave-like can't be localized at an exact time and space. So you have this probability nature of quantum mechanics. Whitehead got that straight away. And his next conclusion from that, he was a brilliant philosopher, years ahead of his time, was that if an electron is a wave, then it takes time, and time is a process, not a thing, then the electron has a future pole and a past pole, a kind of polarity in time between future and past. an electron must have this inherent polarity in time because it's a wave. He then came up with what I think is one of the most original and interesting approaches to the mind-body problem. He came up with the idea that the relation of mind and body is not a relation in space, but in time. Normally, we think of the relation of mind and body in spatial terms. The mind is the inner life, and then there's the outer world. So we think of the mind as the withinness and the outer world as the outsideness of things. But he showed that it made much more sense to think of the mind as the future pole and the body as the past pole. So they're linked together, like the poles of a magnet are linked together. They're connected, but they're not doing the same thing. The future pole of an electron is all the possible things it could do. The future pole is concerned with possibilities. And the Schrödinger wave equation says all the possible things an electron can do. As soon as it interacts with a measuring apparatus or with a physical system, these possibilities collapse down until you get a single observable result. But that's now in the past. So the particle aspect of the wave-particle duality is in the past. As soon as it's happened, it's in the past. And now a whole set of new future possibilities open up. He thought the role of the mind or consciousness was to choose among possibilities. The mind inhabits the realm of possibilities, which are future possibilities, things that haven't yet happened. And as soon as a decision is made, it becomes an observable objective fact, but it's in the past. Now, it's an objective fact that all of us are in this room now. We can be photographed, weighed, measured, etc. But there was a time in the past when we had many possibilities on our minds for this evening. We could have done lots of different things. But we decided to come here. We put our decision into action, and it then is an observable fact we're here. All the possibilities we were considering are not observable facts. They're subjective explorations of possibilities in minds. And when we see that the mind is concerned with possibility, consciousness is primarily, from this point of view, about possibilities and choosing among possibilities. And that the body is the result of choices. Even in our embryonic state, our cells could have gone that way or that way, but a choice was made at every stage in embryology that gave form to our body. I myself think that what I call morphogenetic fields shape these possibilities by restricting them, by collapsing the possibilities down into an ordered pattern. Anyway, this is Whitehead's view, and when you think about it, it opens up all new ways of thinking about nature. The discussion within academic philosophy at the moment is mainly concerned with electrons and their minds, but not terribly interesting, in my view, to think about the mind of an electron. The whole discussion gets much more interesting when you apply it to bigger things. And I myself have been exploring, been thinking about the sun. The sun is a self-organizing system, and from this point of view, the sun would have a mind. The sun would be conscious. Now, we've been brought up to believe the sun is unconscious. It's unconscious matter like the rest of the universe. It is, as I said, just an assumption or a dogma. But as soon as you allow yourself to think maybe the sun's conscious, then you realize that actually all through history, all humanity has thought of the sun as conscious. It's a god or a goddess in most mythologies. In Northern European mythologies, the sun's a goddess. In Southern mythologies, the sun's a god, like Apollo and so on. In India, the sun's a god, Surya. In Japan, the sun is a goddess. In fact, I think that this actually, as an aside, in parentheses, tells us quite a lot about the English language. You may wonder why. Well, the English language is a hybrid of German and French, basically. Anglo-Saxon is a Germanic language, and when the Norman conquest of England happened in 1066, the Normans, though Scandinavian by origin, spoke French, having lived in France. And so the court language for 200 or 300 years in England was French. And English is a kind of a coming together of French and German languages. That's why we have such a rich vocabulary. We have double words for almost everything. We have a French and a German word, like children, for example. Children, Kinder, or enfant, infant. And so we can, but when it came to the sun and the moon, there was a collision of mythological backgrounds. In Germanic, at least in German, the sun is feminine, die Sonne. Whereas in French, it's masculine, le soleil. So what did the English do? Suddenly, the sun's one side of their languages, these languages come together, one's feminine, the other's masculine. What do you do about gender? Well, the English, it was the prototypic English compromise. They just neutralized everything. And so English dropped gender, except for people and ships. And ships are feminine. That's why the English have such a hard time learning other languages. They can't, I had this problem myself. Why is a table or a ruler or a glass, why should they be masculine or feminine? English people just can't get that. Everyone else takes it for granted. Anyway, that's just an aside. But when you think about the consciousness of the sun, then you see, you can ask, well, what does it think about? Well, I suppose one of the things it thinks about is its body, the whole solar system. And what decisions can it make? Well, it sends out solar flares all the time, and if it points them towards the Earth, it could take out our power systems and cause a collapse of civilization as we know it. A big coronal mass ejection pointed towards the Earth would cause complete havoc on Earth for months, if not years. And if it has some choice, a usual assumption is, oh, it's just random. Well, it might not be. And so all these Indians who get up in the morning and say the Gayatri mantra and do the Surya Namaskar and thank the sun for illuminating the earth and ask for it to look after us, maybe doing us a service we take too much for granted. Anyway, as soon as you get into this way of thinking, a whole new way of thinking about nature opens up. There's nothing in science that tells us the sun has to be unconscious. It's not been tested experimentally. It's just an assumption that dates back to the 17th century to a clever French philosopher. I'm not saying the sun definitely is conscious. I'm just saying it's an open question as far as science is concerned. It's an open question. I can't prove it's conscious, but you can't prove it's not. So in fact, there may be ways of investigating it further. So I started with the assumption matter is unconscious, and you see, if you begin to think about it, new possibilities open up. We can set science free from these restrictive dogmatic assumptions. Now I want to turn to the assumption that minds are inside heads. Because this is the assumption that causes so much trouble for those of us who are interested in psychic phenomena. The assumption the mind is nothing but the brain is one of the most basic assumptions of materialism. And it has a great effect on the way we think about ourselves. If our minds are nothing but our brains, they're insulated inside our skulls. We're completely separate from each other, separate individuals. That's our atomistic social philosophy in Europe is based on that. All traditional societies see society as the basic unit. Individuals are part of a society like cells in an organism. But we have a highly individualist view. It started with Thomas Hobbes in England in the 17th century, who was an atomist, who brought the idea of atomism into science and also into social theory by saying human beings are atoms. Society is just a bringing together of atoms in a larger organization, but the basic unit is the individual, and individuals are separate and isolated. And then, of course, when taken seriously, this leads to, it's a depressing philosophy, and it leads to depression, which is the endemic disease of modern civilization. But is it true? It's just an assumption again. And I myself think that our minds are much more like fields. I'm still putting forward extended physical theory of the mind. But you see, we have more options, even in physics, than just matter. In the 17th century, matter was just stuff. Atoms were like little billiard balls. But in the 19th century, our view of matter was enlarged by Michael Faraday and by others who built up the field theory of electricity and magnetism. And Faraday pointed out that a magnet has a field which is in the magnet, but also stretches out invisibly around the magnet. It's part of nature, the field is part of nature, but it's not a material object. Einstein extended this to his idea of the universal gravitational field. The whole of nature is within the universal gravitational field. The gravitational field is not in time and space. According to Einstein, it is time-space. And it's that field which organizes the whole universe and holds everything in place. It's invisible. It's in this room. It's why we're not floating around. This room is full of the invisible gravitational field that's inside the Earth and stretches far beyond it, keeping the moon in its orbit. And your mobile telephone, now switched off, when switched on, has an electromagnetic field within it, and also extending invisibly around it through the electromagnetic radiation that it gives out and picks up. This room is full of invisible radio transmissions from mobile phones, TV and radio stations, and so on. What I'm suggesting is that our minds are based on fields, but those fields are not just confined to the inside of the brain, but they stretch out invisibly far beyond it, just like the fields of your mobile phone stretch out invisibly beyond your mobile phone. The idea it has to be matter that's located with no fields is ridiculous. We know that at least the brain has electromagnetic fields. That's why you can do electroencephalographs by putting electrodes on the scalp. But I'm suggesting in addition to that, it has mental fields which are concerned with the operation of our minds and stretch out into the environment around us. Now, the easiest way to understand this idea is through thinking about the nature of vision. I'll be talking more about this on Friday at my talk in the Society for Scientific Exploration conference that we just heard about at the beginning of this evening. But think about vision. What's going on when you see me now? Well, you all know the standard textbook answer. Light is reflected from me, travels through the electromagnetic field, enters your eyes, inverted images on your retinas, changes in the cone cells, impulses up the optic nerves, and changes occur in different regions of the brain. That's very good as far as it goes. And we know more than we ever have before about which regions of the brain become active. But does it explain vision? Well, no, it explains, or at least it describes, changes in the brain and the optic nerves. It doesn't explain vision for two reasons. The first is, it doesn't explain why you're conscious of what you see, and that's an aspect of the hard problem that I've already alluded to. But secondly, it doesn't explain vision because it tells the dogma is that all your mental activity is inside your brain. So somehow your brain is supposed to create a virtual reality display in 3 dimensions and in full color inside your head. So somewhere inside your head there's a little Rupert, and the rest of this room is somehow inside your head in a 3-dimensional virtual reality display, which no one has ever found. Brain surgeons, when they open up brains, don't see virtual reality displays going on inside brains. But that's the official assumption, that the nervous tissue somehow generates this virtual reality display inside your head. But that's taken for granted. And if you think it through, which a few philosophers have done, it leads to quite absurd conclusions. One philosopher of mind, himself a materialist, said, what happens when you look at the sky at night? The sky you're seeing must be inside your brain, because everything you see and experience is inside your brain. Therefore, your skull must be beyond the sky. Everything we experience is inside our heads. That means our heads must include the whole universe, the whole sky, all the stars. Our skulls are somehow beyond all that. So this is only a virtual skull produced as an illusion within this enlarged reality, which is somehow located inside the head. That's the official view taught in all our schools and universities. But there's an alternative. The alternative is a very simple one. It's so simple it's hard to understand. And that is that your image of me is not located inside your head. It is in your mind. You're interpreting what you see. It's in your mind. It's not located inside your head. Instead, it's located right here, where I am, outside your brain. That vision may involve a two-way process. Light comes in, changes happen in the brain, and then the images are projected out to where they seem to be, projected out in what I call mental fields. Our minds extend out and fill the environment around us, and that's where they produce these images. They're just where they seem to be. If we look at a star at night, our mind literally reaches out over astronomical distances to touch that star, probably also reaches back in time over many light years. So our minds are much more extensive than our brains on this view. In every act of perception, and not just human minds, all minds, animal minds, any animal with image-forming eyes must be, on this view, projecting out a visual world. Now, if this is not an original theory, I claim no originality for it. It's what Plato believed, is what Euclid thought when he worked out mirror reflections. Euclid, who was the great Greek geometer, was the first person to work out a good explanation for mirrors. And he pointed out the mirror, the light's bent by the mirror, it enters your eye, but you project out the images, and because they're virtual images projected out by your mind, the mirror doesn't bend them, they go straight through it, which is why the mirror images are behind the mirror. They're called virtual images in physics textbooks. Traditional peoples all over the world believe that something goes out when you see things. Indians travel hundreds of miles for the darshan, the look of a holy man or woman, because they believe that that look can touch them and affect them and give them blessings. People all over the world, except in Northern Europe, believe that if you look at something with anger or envy, you can affect it negatively. It's called the evil eye, böser Blick in German, malocchio in Italian, nazar in Urdu. So these beliefs are extremely widespread. The idea that we can influence people by looking at them. And it's also a common observable fact that surveys have shown the vast majority of the population have experienced being looked at from behind. You suddenly turn around and someone looking at you, or you can make other people turn around by looking at them. Over 90% of the population have had those experiences, including children. There's a slight sex difference. More men than women have experienced making others turn around when looking at them, and more women than men have experienced being stared at. But most people have had this experience. Now, what does science have to tell us about this? Well, the answer is, until recently, almost nothing. It was just assumed that this is a superstitious belief that only stupid people believe. And educated people know that if this happens, if they turn around, someone's looking at them, it's just a coincidence. They forget all the times they're wrong. They just remember the times when it looks as if there might be some mysterious influence taking place. But that's just because if they're educated, they know that you just dismiss this. It can't happen. It's not real. Well, until the 1980s, virtually no research had been done on the subject, except by a psychic researcher in Holland who started looking into this. Can people really tell when they're being looked at? He found they could. I myself have done lots of experiments now. Many people have taken up this research. And before I talk about the research, let me say that my first step is always to look at the natural history. So I interviewed people whose job it is to look at others. Most of us are amateurs, but police surveillance officers, anti-terrorist squads, the drug squad at Heathrow's, the store detectives at Harrods, and so on. I interviewed all these people and found that they take it for granted that people can tell when they're being looked at. In their world, they know. They don't. It's not a theoretical issue for them, it's a purely practical one. In the martial arts, you can train to become more sensitive because it's useful to know if someone's creeping up behind you to attack you. And you can actually increase your sensitivity in a training program. Anyway, in the simple experiments I do, they're randomized trials. The subject is blindfolded. A person sits behind them in a randomized series of trials, looks at them or doesn't look, and they have to guess if they're being looked at or not, they're right or wrong. In these trials, which are so simple that a child can do them, and thousands of children already have done them, they've been done widely in schools in Britain, Germany, and America. In these trials, the average result, it's not a very big effect, it's like 55% correct, compared with 50% by chance. But replicated over and over and over again, including in Sweden. I ran one experiment here in Sweden, which gave the same results as experiments elsewhere, I'm pleased to say. The effect is very clear. It's now been very widely replicated. And in Amsterdam, the Science Museum there has been running this experiment for nearly 20 years, one of the biggest experiments ever conducted. The results are massively significant statistically. This really seems to happen. Well, this is no surprise to most people because most people believe it happens because they've experienced it. But within the university world, it's a total heresy to suggest that this happens, and you have to pretend it doesn't. When we so I think this is, one more thing, I can't go into much detail on all this, but it also works through closed-circuit television, surprisingly, and people can tell whether they're being watched through closed-circuit television. I've now just launched a new experiment, which is online on my website, together with several other online experiments, so I invite you all to have a go. An online staring experiment, where you, using the camera on your computer, as in Skype-type technologies, you have a partner, you can have one or more other people doing it with you, and you sit there looking at the computer, and the other person, in some trials they see you, and in other trials at random they don't. And you have to guess in each trial if you're being looked at or not over the computer. We only launched this experiment about 2 weeks ago. My webmaster updated it and moved some of the glitches just over the weekend. So I don't have enough data to tell you the results, but you can help gather results by actually doing this experiment. And it's free, it takes only about 5 minutes, it's fun, and it enables anyone to participate in this research. Finally, I'll say a few words about telepathy. I think that when you look at the natural history of telepathy, which I've done by collecting stories from people about their own experiences and about their pets, and other people have collected stories as well, but I think I've got one of the biggest collections, about 10,000 case histories. Patterns clearly emerge. Now, for some people in the scientific world, they say, you shouldn't listen to people's stories because they're just anecdotes. And I looked up the word anecdote because I heard this so often. And in Greek, an means not, and ekdotos means published. An anecdote is an unpublished story. Now, medicine is based on anecdotes, except when they're published, they're promoted to the rank of case histories. And so I take the view that the plural of anecdote is data. And if you have thousands of anecdotes and many people tell you the same kind of story, then something's going on. Now, when you look at this, most cases of telepathy between people and animals occur when they're closely bonded. People with their dogs or cats, and people when they're telepathic with other people, it's usually with parents and children, mothers and babies, lovers, best friends, colleagues, husbands and wives, twins, siblings, and so on. Sometimes therapists and clients. It doesn't happen typically with strangers. And I think I go into this in my book, The Sense of Being Stared At and Other Aspects of the Extended Mind. So you'll find much more detail there, and all the published papers on this and on the sense of being stared at are on my website, available for free. So sheldrake.org is where you can find the details. I'm not giving the details this evening, just a rapid summary. I've done a lot of research on telepathy, and I've done quite a lot with animals because they work much better than people. They're usually more sensitive. I did a lot of research on dogs that know when their owners are coming home, which is summarized in my book, Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home. That's the title of the book. It's also about cats, parrots, horses, and also about many other kinds of telepathy, premonition, and the sense of direction. But many animals pick up their owners' thoughts and intentions. With the dogs that know when their owners are coming home, we did studies in which we filmed the place the dog waited for the whole time the person was out. We had people go at least 8 kilometers from home. They came home at randomly chosen times that we told them by mobile phone. They didn't know in advance when they'd be coming. No one at home knew when they would come. And they traveled by unfamiliar vehicles, taxis or cars that the dog didn't recognize. And over again, these dogs went and waited for them when they set off to come home. It was highly significant statistically. There's a film of one of these experiments on my website that you can see about 5 minutes summarizing this research. I myself am convinced this is a real phenomenon, and so are most pet owners. I mean, about 50% of dogs do it and about 30% of cats. Some only do it a minute or two beforehand, and it could just be visual sound clues, but many dogs or cats do it 10 minutes, 15 minutes, half an hour in advance when the animal couldn't possibly hear them or smell them. And in humans, I've investigated telepathy in many natural conditions. In universities, people tend to look at it under lab conditions in rather artificial situations. And I think that has a very important role to play because it enables you to control the variables better than in the real world. But I myself am a biologist and come to this through natural history. Many mothers claim that they're telepathic with their babies. Their milk lets down when the baby needs them. Even if they're miles away from the baby, their breasts start squeezing out milk, and many mothers feel this happen. And when it happens, they usually assume their baby needs them, and they're nearly always right. I've done studies on this, on nursing mothers in London, 20 different mothers, highly significant results. But by far the commonest kind of telepathy in the modern world is telephone telepathy, where you think of someone who then rings, and you say, that's funny, I was just thinking about you. Or you just know who it is before you answer the phone or look at the caller ID. More than 80% of the population have had this experience in surveys conducted in Britain, Germany, and the United States. And I dare say the same is true in Sweden. It's a case where telepathy has evolved along with modern technologies. I've done many experiments on this. I now have an online telephone telepathy test. It doesn't actually work in Sweden at the moment. It works in Britain and America. But if anyone's sufficiently interested, I could easily get a Swedish version up and running. How my telephone telepathy tests work is that in the basic experiment, we find people who say this happens to them quite often. They sit at home with a mobile phone. They give us the names of 4 people they know well, who they might be telepathic with. We pick one of those 4 people at random with a throw of a dice or a random number table and ask them to ring their friend. The friend is being filmed, and when the phone rings, they have to guess who it is out of these 4 people before they answer the phone, before they pick it up. I think it's John. Hello, John. They're right or they're wrong. If they were doing it by chance, they'd be right 25% of the time. In our filmed experiments with hundreds of trials, They're right 45% of the time. The p-value is 1 times 10 to the minus 12. For those of you who are into statistics, it's more significant than the existence of the Higgs boson. We've now done, this has been replicated in Freiburg University in Germany and in Amsterdam University in Holland. And the automated version involves 2 callers. It's easier to recruit 2 people than 4 people to do it with you. You register online, and then your callers, one of the 2 callers is randomly selected to be the one that talks to you or to think about you and to call you. And when you're being called, you get instructions on the mobile phone. It says, one of your callers is calling now. Press 1 for Andrew and press 2 for Julian. And so you guess, and as soon as you guess, the line opens up, so you get instant feedback. It's fun to do. The whole experiment takes a quarter of an hour. It's free for participants, but not for me. I have to pay for the calls. As I say, I could, if any of you are interested, I could get this set up for Sweden, but it is working well in Britain and in the US at the moment. So many of these experiments are in fact quite accessible to ordinary people using modern technology. I've also done experiments with text messages, SMS messages, and with emails, and they show exactly the same principles as telephone telepathy with highly significant positive results. So I think our minds are extended beyond our brains through attention when we're looking at something, and intention when we have the intention to call somebody. And in fact, the very words attention and intention imply this. The Latin root of attention is ad tendere, which means to stretch towards. The mind stretches towards what you pay attention to. Intention is to stretch into, in tendere. So I think our minds stretch out beyond our brains all the time, just like mobile phone signals stretch out. They're not inside our heads. And when you have that view of the mind, telepathy becomes perfectly normal. It's normal in animals, it's not paranormal, it's not supernatural, it's natural. Animals are much better at it than we are. And when it comes to precognition, I think they're better at it than we are. The dogs can give animals can give warnings of earthquakes and tsunamis. I discuss that in my book on animals. Humans often have precognitive dreams. So I think our minds are extended not only in space, but also in time. We know they're extended into the past through memory, but they also extend to link to themselves in the future through precognition or premonition. So I myself think that these phenomena, which have been investigated for over 100 years by psychic researchers, are keys to understanding the nature of our minds. This whole field of research is the Cinderella of the sciences. It's a kind of taboo area of research because it doesn't fit into the materialist worldview. And all of us who are interested in this field have had the experience of arguing with so-called skeptics who are convinced these things can't happen. And they know in advance that all the data must be flawed. Most of them, in my experience, don't look at the data. They're not interested in it because they think it's a waste of time looking at it because it's impossible. Here's another example of where a dogmatic belief system is holding back the progress and development of science. It turns out that all through science, in all these 10 areas I referred to, memory, inheritance, the so-called laws of nature, which I think are more like habits, and I think there's a kind of memory in nature, and they're not all fixed, they evolve. It turns out every single one of these dogmas is highly questionable. That's why the subtitle of my book is Freeing the Spirit of Inquiry, or in America the title is Science Set Free, because I believe that the sciences have all been imprisoned by this dogmatic belief system. And I think that when we break free of it, science, I'm totally pro-science. I'm not anti-science at all. I spent my whole career doing research, and I still do a great deal of research. I think that the sciences will be liberated, and they'll become much more interesting and much more fun, and probably a lot cheaper as well. So let me leave you with that thought. Thank you.